I now give the floor to Her Excellency Unity Dao, Minister for International Affairs and Cooperation of Botswana. Honorable Minister, you have the floor.
Mr. President, I'm deeply honored to address this supremely important assembly, and this I do on behalf of the President of the Republic of Botswana, His Excellency Dr. Mokgweetsi Eric Masisi, and on behalf of the people of that republic. Allow me, on behalf of my delegation, to join previous speakers in congratulating you on your assumption of the presidency of the 74th session of the United Nations General Assembly. Mr. President, we are confident that you will benefit from your leadership and wealth and experience during your tenure in your office. You can count on my country's support in your discharge of your mandate. Let me also seize this opportunity to pay a special tribute to your predecessor, Her Excellency Ms. Maria Fernanda Espinosa Garcés, for a sterling stewardship in the just ended 73rd session. She leaves behind a legacy which we are convinced you will effectively carry forward. Mr. President, Botswana fully endorses the theme of this year's General Assembly session, that is galvanizing multilateral efforts for poverty eradication, quality education, climate change, and inclusion. It is both relevant and timely as it reaffirms the key role of the multilateral system as the ultimate framework through which we can collectively transform our societies. This theme further challenges us as a global community to recommit to the noble goal of leave no one behind, and to do our utmost to reach the furthest behind, who usually include the vulnerable in our societies, such as women, the youth, and people living with disabilities. My delegation is particularly pleased that the theme embodies the priorities you have identified. We therefore concur that we should redouble our efforts to effectively tackle poverty and all forms of inequalities. Inequality remains a problem in developing countries, including in middle-income countries such as my own. Inequality and exclusion are threats to peace and thus demand urgent address by all of us. Equally, we wish to acknowledge the pivotal role of quality education and the need to invest more in this sector to enable us to accelerate implementation of the 2030 Agenda. In this regard, we applaud your commitment to leverage on high-level meetings such as the SDG Summit, the Climate Action Summit, universal health coverage, and financing for development, to galvanize political commitment to urgently address the most pressing global challenges that affect our people and our planet. These high-level engagements, involving as they do world leaders from government, the private sector, academia, and civil society, provide a unique opportunity to build and reinvigorate partnerships around our common development objectives. Mr. President, we note with satisfaction that 2019 has been a significant year in the implementation of the SDGs, as a number of countries have presented their voluntary national reviews indicating their status of implementation of the goals. Botswana presented her voluntary national review report in 2017. We regard this process as a valuable accountability mechanism that monitors progress towards the attainment of SDGs, and we encourage that it should continue. Mr. President, Botswana, like many countries in the United Nations, is confronted by many challenges, including extreme poverty and inequalities. In this regard, our government continues to direct significant resources towards inclusive development and economic growth. Consequently, we have various policies on poverty eradication programs to support the most vulnerable in our society, such as orphans and people living with disabilities. Mr. President, voluntary national review process was indeed instrumental in identifying the gaps and major challenges that still hinder our full implementation of the SDGs. These challenges include youth unemployment, poverty, rising social and economic inequalities, climate change, and unsustainable patterns of consumption, as well as unsustainable patterns of production. The process further identified financing gaps. We therefore note and consider public-private partnership as critical in both resource mobilization for and implementation of the SDGs. Equally important is that we should continue to work together to create an enabling and global environment that ensures that all countries can participate in a fair and rule-based global trading system. As already indicated above, Botswana recognizes the importance of quality education. That is education that empowers, education that fuels prosperity, education that positions citizens to be globally competitive. In recognition of this, Botswana have invested significantly in this area at all levels of education, and indeed we are pleased to state that we have successfully attained gender parity in access to education. But there still remains a lot to be done. We still have to address issues of large class sizes, under-resourced schools and institutions, old infrastructure, and insufficient and old technologies. These are challenges, as quality education is the only way any country can be a participant and a beneficiary of the fourth industrial revolution. Mr. President, climate change. Climate change is indeed one of the greatest challenges we face today. We therefore commend the Secretary General for convening 2 summits on climate change during the session involving world leaders and the world's youth. This enabled deliberations on climate change-related actions addressing reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and achieving zero net target by 2050. The science is very clear, and that unless there is urgent action, climate change will reverse the many gains that we have made in key sectors of our economy. Mr. President, Botswana is already, like other African countries, experiencing the effects of climate change. These include desertification, heat waves, and recurrent droughts. As I address you today, Botswana and some of her neighbors have declared 2019 a drought year. Crops have failed and livestock is dying. In addition, our fellow neighbors Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe have suffered catastrophic effects of Cyclone Idai, which resulted in significant loss of life and massive destruction of infrastructure and property. We take this opportunity to commend the sub-region and the international community for timely response that they rendered in support of the countries affected by the cyclone. We note that the rebuilding of lives and livelihoods will take time, and therefore we urge that the support continue to be directed to those countries. We also reiterate our deepest sympathies and condolences to the government and the people of Bahamas in the aftermath of Hurricane Dorian. It is clear that we need to adopt permanent mitigation adaptation measures, as well as a robust response to collective support affected countries. Mr. President, Botswana remains fully committed to the Paris Agreement, on which we have anchored our national development objectives. In this regard, as part of our mitigation and adaptation drive, we have developed a climate change policy as well as a strategy. Furthermore, in our intended nationally determined contributions, Botswana has committed to reduce greenhouse gases emissions by 15% by 2030 based on the 2010 baseline. We therefore appeal for concerted global action to support our efforts through provision of technologies of finance and capacity building in order to achieve our intended national determined contributions. Mr. President, allow me to address an equally pressing environmental issue that is of major concern to Botswana. I must say, as we collectively grapple with the finding prudent and innovative ways of managing our environment and its ecosystems for sustainable use, human life conflict is a serious challenge for Botswana and the sub-region. Our elephant population has grown to unmanageable proportions and is now exceeding the carrying capacity of its designated area of habitat. Elephants are now aggressively encroaching on many human settlements around the country. Elephants outside national parks invade homes and farms and kill people and destroy property. But also, elephants within parks are destroying their own very environment because of the overpopulation in those areas. Mr. President, Botswana has an outstanding track record in the conservation and protection of wildlife, flora, and fauna. In this context, 40% of our land is reserved as protected area for wildlife and conservation. This demonstrates our steadfast commitment to protecting wildlife, to curbing illegal and to curbing illegal trade in wildlife and species. This commitment comes at a huge cost and sacrifice. A multifaceted response with the support and understanding of our international partners is urgently called for. We fully concur as espoused in the founding principles of the Convention on the International Trade in Endangered Species and Wild Fauna that societies, people and states should and must be the best protectors of their own wildlife, fauna, and flora. In this regard, Botswana, together with the sub-region of Southern Africa, has been working tirelessly to find sustainable solutions. As I already intimated, Botswana firmly believes that as part of the solution lies the working with the very communities who live in or adjacent to protected areas. These communities must be supported to effectively coexist with wildlife and to enable them to contribute to anti-poaching efforts. This is indeed critical as competition for food and land between people and animals intensifies. Mr. President, in an effort to bolster our elephant conservation and management efforts, Botswana and countries in the sub-region recently tabled a proposal to allow a one-off sale of ivory from countries whose populations are currently at CITES Appendix 2. This prudent approach was regrettably rebuffed, despite our best efforts to demonstrate that the revenues accrued from such sales of ivory stockpiles would be used in conservation efforts just as we have done previously. We were thus disappointed that much of the discussion at the CITES COP18 focused on increased restrictions on wildlife trade when the fundamental purpose of the convention is to regulate and facilitate international trade. Equally disheartening were also attempts to extend the scope of the convention in a manner that would infringe on sovereign matters. This proposal, which did not succeed, sought to close all domestic trade in ivory. Mr. President, I cannot emphasize enough that in order to deliver our development aspirations of living in harmony with nature and ensuring sustainable use of our natural resources, we must facilitate to implement pragmatic natural resource management plans which contribute to our national development agenda. Mr. President, Botswana welcomes the convening of the high-level dialogue on financing and development. In this regard, the UN should continue to pay special attention to the unique needs of least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, small-island developing states, middle-income countries, and countries emerging from conflict. We welcome the convening of the high-level meeting to review progress made in addressing the priorities of the small island developing states through the implementation of the Samoa Pathway. This review will afford us an opportunity to reassess the priorities built on lessons learned and develop meaningful and transformative solutions. Equally important is the midterm review conference of the Vienna Programme of Action on landlocked developing countries for the decades 2014 to 2024 that will be convened in December. This review is an opportunity for us to take stock of the progress made and to address challenges in the implementation of the program. At the national level, we consider the program as a vital framework to further drive our development agenda through trade facilitation and greater access to global markets. Mr. President, Botswana is of the view that South-South triangular cooperation is a fundamental platform for enhancing cooperation amongst all countries for mutual benefit. We recognize the importance of sustainable development, and that is complementary to North-South cooperation. To this end, Botswana has developed a South-South and triangular cooperation strategy. The strategy will facilitate exchange of knowledge and experiences, as well as leverage on appropriate technologies to bolster national capacities to accelerate implementation of the SDGs. And Mr. President, as a global leader in diamond mining, we stand firmly behind the Kimberley process. an international mechanism set up to stem the flow of conflict diamonds and promote legitimate diamond trade. We therefore look forward to our chairship of the Kimberley process in 2021, and we will work with all the other members to strengthen the mechanism. Furthermore, we will prioritize, among others, capacity building for members of the Kimberley process, especially those members emerging from conflict. Mr. President, as part of our commitment to a peaceful world order, Botswana recently became a state party to the Arms Trade Treaty. We have also just signed the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. This speaks to our commitment to contribute to global peace and security through complete disarmament by eliminating illicit trade in conventional and nuclear weapons. Humanity should not invest in its own destruction, but rather in its own prosperity. Mr. President, the scourge of terrorism threatens to reverse the hard-earned peace and security gains. We should spare no effort in the fight against terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. We note with satisfaction that the new Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact will, among other things, provide capacity building and technical assistance for developing countries, particularly in Africa. Similarly, we welcome the efforts of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, as well as the UN Office on Counterterrorism to address these challenges. Botswana remains fully committed to combat all acts of terrorism and to resolutely confront associated malpractices, such as illicit financial flows and money laundering. We, however, wish to caution that the de-risking approaches taken by governments, correspondent banks, and other financial institutions should take into consideration the unintended consequences of such measures. We caution that among the unintended consequences are discouraging the use of banking facilities, limited access to banking facilities, and the possible collapse of small banks and small economies. Moving forward, though, we will remain engaged with all relevant stakeholders to eliminate any deficiencies in our anti-money laundering and counterterrorism strategies. Mr. President, we strive for a world that is for peace and prosperity, and allow me to say that Botswana aligns herself with the statement delivered by the United Republic of Tanzania in her capacity as the chair of SADC regarding the lifting of sanctions in Zimbabwe. There is no doubt that these prolonged sanctions gravely undermine the economy of Zimbabwe and inflict severe hardship on the honored people of that country. We also wish it to be noted that sanctions on any country do not only negatively affect the targeted country, but also their neighbors and their trading partners. And in the case of Zimbabwe, it's no different. Mr. President, in conclusion, it is evident that our multilateral system is under serious threat. We cannot deny that we are indeed experiencing an unprecedented deterioration of the very common values that bind us as the UN family, as enshrined in our UN Charter. It is imperative that we marshal our collective resolve to revive the culture of diplomacy, the culture of tolerance, of mutual respect, and to fully embrace the strength of our diversity for the survival of a multilateral system. We therefore call for a re-strengthening of the rules-based order anchored on the principles of international law and geared towards strengthening international cooperation for prosperity for all nations, big or small. As Botswana, we remain committed to the multilateral order and believe in a strong and effective UN system as an organization that is people-centered, representative, harmonious, accountable, and anchored on the sovereign equality of the nations. As we look forward to the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the UN, we must seize this opportunity to reaffirm that this august body remains relevant today as it was in 1945 when it was founded. I once again, Mr. President, reaffirm my government's commitment to the attainment of the Sustainable Development Goals, to the attainment of Africa's Agenda 2063, and to the creation of a better world characterized by shared prosperity where no one is left behind. I thank you for your attention. Pula, may it rain. Thank you.
I thank the Honourable Minister for her statement.